Money affects us all, from the second we're born into this world to the moment we leave it. It shapes how and where we live, the opportunities we get, the choices we make. And yet, for something so central to our lives, most people are unaware of the glaring disparities in the wealth distribution across America.
What does wealth inequality really look like in this country? We found that most people have no idea.
The top 1% of Americans own nearly 35% of the nation's wealth. And if we were to expand that to the top 10% as a whole, they control about 70%, meaning the bottom 90% is left with just around 30%. And if you can believe it, that's not even the worst part. But I'll get back to that in a moment.
The problem we're trying to solve is that there are rich teams and there are poor teams. Then there's 50 feet of crap. And then there's us.
Wealth inequality isn't just another problem in a sea of problems that Americans face. I think of it as the greatest problem threatening our country, and one that will affect every single one of us, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. But if that's the case, then why isn't it talked about like it is? Why isn't this a top issue for every American? Well, for one, most people are in denial about the facts of this matter.
How many pieces of the pie would you put on the middle class?
Put 4.
4, all right, that's the middle class.
But two, it's better if we're distracted so we don't really see the truth. Instead, we'll spend more time waging wars against one another over culture, identity politics, left versus right. We get caught up in battles that, in the grand scheme of things, don't change the fact that a handful of people own nearly everything, while the rest of us fight over scraps.
The Gulf of Mexico is now called the Gulf of America, and people get excited. Like, how the fuck does that help your wallet?
When we talk about wealth inequality, we aren't just talking about income inequality, although that is a concerning problem too. Income inequality is the unequal distribution of what we make, but wealth inequality is about the unequal distribution of what we own, and is often tracked by net worth, things like houses, stocks, businesses, savings, minus any outstanding debt. Now, studies have shown that when Americans are asked to estimate wealth distribution, they think it's far more equal than it actually is. There's a study from Harvard Business School that asked people how they thought wealth was distributed among different earners, and they divided the population up into 5 different categories: the top 20%, the second 20, the middle 20, the fourth 20, and the bottom 20. Now, 9 out of 10 Americans agreed the ideal distribution should look something like this. What they believed it looked like was this. They thought the top 20% owned about 60% of the wealth. Now, if we were to combine the top 20 with the second 20, well, they thought they would own about 80% of the wealth. But what it really looked like was this. The top 20% of Americans owned closer to 90%, and the top 1%, they owned around 40%. And the bottom 40% can barely be seen on the graph. CBS also did a study like this in 2020, where they asked shoppers to divide up a pie into 5 different categories, and the results once again confirmed that people significantly underestimated how much the ultra-wealthy hold, and that they also overestimated what the middle class had.
So can I show you what reality looks like?
Not like this, obviously.
Unfortunately not. No one was even close. So it's actually 9 pieces of pie.
Wow.
Yeah. 90% of the wealth is right here in the top.
That's terrible.
Now, this misconception benefits the ultra-wealthy because if people don't realize how bad the problem is, they aren't going to demand a change. The gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else wasn't always this obscene, but over the last 40 years or so, wealth inequality has gone into overdrive, and that's by no accident.
So I have a message for my fellow plutocrats and zillionaires, and for anyone who lives in a gated bubble world. Wake up. Wake up. It cannot last. Because if we do not do something to fix the glaring economic inequities in our society, the pitchforks will come for us. For no free and open society can long sustain this kind of rising economic inequality. It has never happened. There are no examples. You show me a highly unequal society and I will show you a police state or an uprising. The pitchforks will come for us if we do not address this. It's not a matter of if, it's when.
The Roman Empire once had a little trick called bread and circuses. They believed that if they kept the people fed and entertained, they wouldn't revolt. Today, it's culture wars, social media, and Netflix. And while we're binging the latest drama, the real drama is unfolding in Congress, where billionaires and corporations are buying politicians like they're drafting a fantasy football lineup. And while both parties are in on it, one side generally wants to promote trickle-down economics, which has been debunked time and time again. But I'll get back to that in a moment. Here's the truth. The top 1% don't work harder than you. They might not even be smarter than you. They were born on third base and convinced you that they hit a triple. Or they got extremely lucky with opportunity, timing, or circumstance. Now that doesn't mean they haven't worked incredibly hard and taken risks. But this idea that the CEO is working 300 times harder than the average employee needs to be smashed. According to the Economic Policy Institute, CEO pay has soared over 1,000% since 1987. Meanwhile, the typical worker's pay has gone up only 24%. Yeah, and before someone brings up the free market argument, let's be real. What we have isn't truly a free market. It's a system where the wealthiest individuals and corporations shape the rule in their favor. They exploit tax loopholes, use offshore accounts, hire teams of lobbyists to ensure policies work for them. They also have access to exclusive investment opportunities, hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, and high-return real estate options that multiply wealth far beyond what the average person could achieve with a 401k or a savings account. And even with public markets, they have the capital to take bigger risks and leverage tax-advantaged strategies. But the average worker? Well, they have little bargaining power. Union membership has plummeted over the years, wages have stagnated, and essential costs for things like housing, food, and healthcare keep rising. Now, wealth isn't just about income. It's about who gets to grow their money and who doesn't. And those at the top have spent decades making sure that the system stays like this. Don't believe me? Who do you think suffered the most during the Great Financial Crisis? In percentage terms, it certainly wasn't the wealthy.
I have a feeling that in a few years, people are going to be doing what they always do when the economy tanks. They will be blaming immigrants and poor people.
Now, some will argue, but the rich do pay more in taxes. The top 1% pay 46% of all federal income taxes. And sure, if you look at income taxes, that may be true. But that's not where real wealth is. The richest Americans make most of their money from stocks, real estate, and business ownership, things that are taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, the same people who proposed Project 25, posted this graph trying to make the case that the rich already pay way more in taxes than everyone else. Now, this graph fails to consider the relative tax rate, and it also fails to contextualize how much more money the top 1% make. Hell, even the top 10%. But this is also a graph of income, not wealth, as wealth is generally not taxed as high as income. Most wealthy people end up paying 15% on capital gains tax, while the highest possible rate being 20%. Now, this is far lower than the highest federal income tax rate. So while the ultra-rich can pay a higher share of income taxes, they are often benefiting from a lower overall tax rate on their wealth accumulation. And this isn't just me saying so. Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in America, has long proposed something called the Buffett Rule. And this is the basic principle that no household making over $1 million annually should pay a smaller share of their income in taxes than middle-class families pay. Warren Buffett has famously stated that he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary does. And he's long tried to convince Congress that enacting this Buffett Rule would stimulate economic growth and decrease wealth inequality. Now, interestingly enough, this rule was included in a 2012 piece of legislation, but of course it never passed. It included a 30% effective tax rate for individuals making over $1 million a year. And this was particularly aimed at individuals who had large capital gains income. But many Republicans framed this bill as an example of class warfare, arguing that it unfairly targeted high earners and that this would hurt job creation, economic growth, and discourage investments in the stock market.
He thinks the government should take more from some people just because they're rich, even if the tax increases hurt the economy.
So why would taxing the rich help reduce wealth inequality? Well, for decades, we've been sold the myth of trickle-down economics. This idea that if we cut taxes for the wealthy, their prosperity will somehow trickle down to everyone else. In reality, this has never really worked. Instead of reinvesting their gains into job creation or higher wages, the ultra-rich tend to hoard their wealth. They buy back stocks and park money in tax shelters. Meanwhile, the rest of the country generally sees stagnant wages, rising costs, and fewer opportunities to build real wealth. The real driver of economic growth isn't tax cuts for billionaires and corporations. It's a strong middle class. When everyday people have more money, they spend more. That means more demand for goods and services, more business growth, more jobs, and higher wages. But it also means more people can afford to invest in things like homes, stocks, and retirement funds, which allow for them to build long-term wealth instead of just scraping by. When wealth is more evenly distributed, the entire economy is stronger. So what are you supposed to do with this information? I know it all feels rather bleak, but for me, the sole purpose of this video is to try to spread awareness around how out of control wealth inequality has become. The more I learned about this topic, the more I was confused as to why this wasn't a major issue for nearly every voter. And right now, most people aren't even paying attention. When they've given us the modern day version of bread and circuses, the people at the top are trying to make sure nothing ever really changes. Don't be fooled by the next tax bill that promises middle class savings while quietly handing the wealthy an even bigger break. They want us looking left and right so that we never look up. And as long as that keeps working, they'll win. So at the very least, don't fall for the distractions. If you feel like things are rigged against you, you're not crazy. If you feel like no one in power is actually trying to fix this, you're not entirely wrong. The wealthiest people in the country aren't sitting around debating this. They're writing the rules. And they're counting on the fact that we're too overwhelmed, too misinformed, or too distracted to push back. No one's coming to fix this. That's the point.
It's an unfair game. We are the last dog at the bowl. You see what happens to the runt of the litter? He dies.
The only thing that has ever really forced change is enough people refusing to accept the status quo. And that all begins with awareness. The more people who actually understand what's happening, the harder it will be for the top to keep pretending that this is normal or that it will somehow just magically get better. It won't. The widening of the gap will continue. So if this video made you see things differently, share it, talk about it. Make sure people around you understand and start seeing the bigger picture. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it.